But what you see is China has begun its steady and eventual rise. And as I mentioned to you before, right now, the new order book for China has them controlling 70.9% of the global share. That's going to be in our second video that'll be coming out in a few days. Now, the second element they look at here is, why does a country wish to have a shipbuilding industry? Now, President Trump has deemed shipbuilding to be an essential industry for the United States. Now, the essay here looks largely at heavy industry and manufacturing elements here. I would argue one of the things that BRS does not look at, and I think it's a key one, is how does commercial shipbuilding fit into the overarching narrative of global sea power? And to me, that is a key component. They don't talk about naval shipping here at all in the BRS report. But I think if the U.S. wants to be a true sea power, then it needs to have both naval and commercial. If you look at China, Japan, and Korea, they kind of embrace that. But if we look solely at industry, for example, one of the things we see is how big workforces play a role here. For example, they have this element to just demonstrate the size of workforces. CSSC, which is the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, employs over 300,000 workers in its workforce. If you go over to Imbari, for example, in Japan, 10,000, Hyundai Heavy Industries, 15,000, Fincantieri over in Italy, 21,000, Chantier de l'Antique, 3,500 in France, and then Damen, 12,500 over in Netherlands. One of the reasons we see China dominating literally this is because of their wages. A chart in here says that the average wage for employed persons in urban manufacturing in China in 2024 is 10,800 yuan. If you translate that over into US dollars, it's about $15,000. Is what they're making. So it's not a great amount of money for surviving in an industrialized area. But they did include this chart, which shows hourly wages and benefits. Now, it is dated. It only goes back to 1997. But one of the things you note here, for example, in German shipyards, probably the highest paid at over $30. If you look at U.S. yards, you're only under $20 an hour in 1997. And if you've had a job like I have, you know that wages haven't really gone up tremendously over the years. And this is one of the big problems, is it's very hard to entice people into workforce yards to do work when you can find other jobs that pay as much, if not a better work environment. Now, the third question they ask is, why does a country wish to have a shipbuilding industry? Now, for countries like Japan and Korea, this occupies a good chunk of their national income. I mean, it's sizable, especially Korea, where it makes up almost 4% of the global domestic product. The United States is much smaller, and this has been a problem. However, since the U.S. is the largest trading nation on the planet, you would think that this should resonate across the board. I would argue that the U.S. does a terrible job in talking about this. For most Americans, they don't realize where their goods come from. If you're like most Americans, you order your stuff on your phone, it shows up on Amazon that it's at some warehouse close to you, and then it's going to be at your house in 24 hours. What you don't realize is how much that good has been traveling for the past 2 to 6 months, largely over the world's oceans, to get to that warehouse close to you for its final delivery. Point number 4 they make, abundant and cheap labor. Is that sufficient to succeed in shipbuilding? And that's where their point number 5 comes in. It's not just abundant and cheap labor. That's not the only conditions for success. And they list out several here for you. Number 1, investment in the shipbuilding industry to meet tougher quality standards. One of the big problems we've seen before is that China was largely identified, especially in the 1990s, as cheap build. I mean, it was just cheap. It's going to fall apart. Chinese ships are not that way anymore in many ways. As a matter of fact, Chinese steel is definitely seen as a much better quality, and their shipbuilding is much better. However, Chinese ships are not meant to last 30, 40 years like ships in the past. They're specifically designed to last 15 to 25 years because China wants to recycle ships and rebuild ships. Second point, a short supply chain characterized by the domestic manufacturing of most of the components necessary for the construction of ships. Japan, China, and Korea have that. They have the supply chains in place to feed into the shipyards. This is one of the big things holding up ship production, I would argue, in the United States.